Good morning, everyone. In the last session, we are trying to discuss about the one of the important example called how we can write the programmatic transactions here. So using this particular transaction template, we define the programmatic transactions here. Okay. So this is one of the important example we are discussing here. So here, what we are doing here, we are trying to get in the base. So we are trying to providing. So this particular the transaction template internally it will give you the information about the how this particular transaction template is going to work here. Okay, so today we are going to discuss about the another important section called how we can declare the transaction. Getting the bit. So what are the ways we can declare this particular transactions here? So this is another important section we are discussing here. So to understand this particular transactions, the declaring a transaction, now what we will do, we will try to use the transactions annotations here. Getting the bit. So we are going to use the transaction annotation here. So I'm going to provide this particular annotation called transactional. Now you can see, so we are going to write this particular annotation, and inside this particular annotation we have a different types of properties we have. So we need to understand the each and every properties how it is going to work here. Okay, so before going to work about this particular transactions here in the namespace, like in our configuration file, we need to enable the transaction functionality here. So whatever the transaction functionality we are having, we need to enable those functionality here. Okay, because here we are trying to come up with the annotations here. Okay, so before going to discuss about this particular annotation, now what we will do, we'll try to discuss about the properties first here. What are the properties we are having here? In our the declarative transaction, in our declarative transactions here, so whatever the transaction attributes we are going to define here, it will try to hold the so it will try to provide the required informations here. So for example, if I'm trying to come up with the propagation behavior, so propagation behavior, so what exactly the propagation behavior will do, it will try to provide the first facet of this particular transaction is propagation behavior. The propagation behavior, it will try to define the boundaries of the transaction. Getting the point? It will try to define the boundaries of the transaction and with respect to the client and the method calling here.
70% discount. इंटरनेट से मंगाना सही रहेगा क्या?
Okay, so this is very important information we need to understand here. So basically, what we are understanding here. So if you understand, this is the propagation behavior is one of the first facet we are going to use under this particular transaction annotations here. Okay, so what exactly it will do? It will try to provide the boundaries for this particular client and the method being called here. So wherever we are trying to execute the method here, it is going to provide the relation between the client applications and the particular method. Okay, so what are the different propagations we are having here? Now if I'm going to write here on top of this particular transactional, we can easily understand this. You can easily understand this. So now you can see, so this is the propagation we are going to write here. Okay, so propagation is equals to, if I'm trying to write this particular mandatory, propagation mandatory, basically it is one of the enum here. It is one of the enum. So indicates that the method must run with a transaction. Mandatory is nothing but the method must be run with a transaction. If we are not having any existing transaction in the progress, now what happens here? So an exception is going to throw here. Getting the point. So this is important information we need to understand here. Whenever we are trying to write this particular propagation mandatory, the method it should run with a transaction. If the method is not running the transaction, we'll get an exception. Okay, if you are not interested in this particular mandatory, now what we can do, we can go for the nested one. Okay, we can go for the nested. So now again, what happened in this particular nested here? The nested also is indicating, getting the pen. The nested also it's trying to run with a transaction. Getting the pen. So if the nested transaction, because if it is having any dependency, for example, whenever I'm trying to call this particular save person method, if the save person it is trying to call from the save person, if it is trying to call from the transaction, so the same transaction it is going to use here. Okay, so in that case we'll call it as the nested transactions here. Getting the point. Now what happens internally? So it is going to indicate the method. The method should run with a nested transaction if the transaction is in the existing. Getting the point. So whatever the existing transaction in the process, it will try to use the same transactions here. Getting the point. If we are not having any existing transactions here, if we are not having any existing transactions here, it is going to behave. We have one more like a attribute called required here. So it is going to behave like one more attribute called required. It will something like it will try to run with the transaction if the method is not having any transaction, it will try to create the new transactions here. Okay, so this is important. So basically nested will do the two types of operations here. First, it will try to identify if the method having any existing transaction. Okay, it will use the existing transaction. If the existing transaction is not available, it will try to behave like a required transaction. Required transaction, basically it will check any transaction is available, it will try to use, otherwise it will come up with a new transaction. So same thing it is going to applicable inside this particular nested here. So basically only one thing here, it will try to come up with any dependent transactions also. If it is available, it will reuse here. So otherwise it will try to create the new transactions here. So inside this particular nested, this is one of the important example we need to understand here. Getting the point. So propagation mandatory, basically wherever we are using this particular propagation mandatory, the method should run with a transaction. If the method is not running with the transaction, it is going to throw an exception here. It is going to throw an exception. So the nested will be, it will not throw any exception, it will come up with a new transaction. So this is the differences here. And another one is never here. Can you depend? So whenever we are making this particular never, the transaction can you depend? So the current method should not run with the transaction. If the method is running with the transaction, it is going to throw an exception. So this is important information we need to understand here. Which method we don't require transaction, we can make those transactions with the never. If the method is trying to run this with existing transaction, it is going to throw an exception. Getting the point. So this is one of the important example we need to understand here. This is one of the important example, never. So far we discussed about the mandatory, nested, and never. Getting the point. This is important here. And the same way, now what we can identify here. So here the propagation not supported here. Propagation not supported. Now what happens internally? So this particular attribute is indicating that the method should not run with the transaction, and if an existing transaction in the progress, so it will be suspended. It will be suspended. So duration of this particular method execution. This is important here. So method not supported. What we can identify here, the method not supported, basically this particular method, it is not going to run with any transaction if any existing transactions are in the progress. So what happens here, until the completion of this particular method, the transaction is going to be suspended here. So this is the behavior of this particular not supported. So another we are having required here. Okay, so required. Now what we can understand here, so this particular attribute is going to indicate that the current method should run with a transaction. If we are not having any existing transaction in the progress, so the method will run with a new transaction. Getting the point? If you are having any existing transaction, same existing transaction is going to use, Otherwise, the new transaction is going to start it. So required here. This is important here. So far, whatever the attributes we are discussing here, let me write one more time here. So if we observe, first one is mandatory. Mandatory basically, wherever we are using this particular mandatory, it should run with the method should run with a transaction. If the method is not running with a transaction, it will throw an exception. Okay, and another one is nested. So nested basically what it will do, it will try to look up any nested transaction. So for example, if the method is trying to call from any controller class, from the controller, if you are having any transaction, the transaction will call it as a nested transaction. And the nested transaction, if it is available, it use the same method. So otherwise, now what we will do, it will move on to the new transactions here. Okay, so nested is going to do the 3 steps of operation. So first one is it will try to look up the nested. Okay, it will try to look up the nested transaction. I'm trying to write the TX here. And if the nested transaction is not available, it will try to look up the original transaction here. So like a main transaction. Instead of checking with nested here, we can check with the main transaction. Okay, if the main transaction is also not available, now what happens internally? It will try to look up the new transactions here.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
So this nested transaction and the main is both are different.
See, basically, nested basically, if you see, we have a one controller class. In the controller, again, we are using the save method. Okay, on top of the controller, we are having one transaction. Okay, whenever we are calling this particular save method, the service method in the service class, the same save method it's going to call. So here, if you are trying to start with any transaction, this is the parent transaction for this particular service class. Like it is the main transaction for this particular service class. But here we are having one transaction because with the help of this particular transaction, we are calling the service class save method. Okay, this is the nested transaction. But here, if the nested transaction is not available, it will try to create the main transaction. Main transaction is basically whenever we are using at that a transaction, and if you are trying to use the required or required new, it will try to create the new transaction. So this new transaction, it is not the same of this particular controller class transaction. Getting the point. So if the controller class transaction, it is trying to call the same method. So this transaction, we can call it as a nested one. If the nested transaction is not available, the service class, it will try to create the new transaction with help of this particular propagation dot required here. So here it will try to create the new transaction.
Got it.
Okay. So now you can see like we have a mandatory we identified, and we identify this particular nested section, and here never. So never basically, if the method does not support any transaction, we can go for this particular never. And here, if method having any transactions internally, it is going to throw an exception. This is important here. Getting the point. So whenever we are making this particular never, we should very carefully here if what kind of the method it should not support the transaction. We need to check explicitly. Then only we can make the transactions annotations here with help of this particular never. And another one, propagation not supported. So here what we can identify this particular not supported here. So basically this particular not supported, wherever we are using on top of this particular method, the method should not support the transaction. If we are having any existing transaction here, until the completion of this particular method execution, the transaction is going to be suspended, like the transaction is going to be hold here. Okay, so this is important, we need to understand regarding this particular not supported here. And the last one we identified here, required here. So required basically whenever we are making this particular propagation, the method should run with a transaction. If you are having any existing transaction, it will try to use the existing transaction. And if you are not having any existing transactions here, now what happens internally? It will try to create the new transaction. Okay, it will try to create the new transaction. And along with this particular required here, we have another one, required new here. Another one we are having, required new. So what we can identify this particular required new, every time this particular propagation, it will try to create the new transactions here. So compared to this particular required and required new, it will check the existing transaction. If you are having any existing transaction, it will use here. But in case of this particular required new, even though if you are having the required like existing transaction, it will not use any existing transaction. For each and every call, the method is going to create the new transactions here. Okay, so these are all the propagation behavior. So this is very important information we are discussing here, because this propagation only, it will try to identify the, so what kind of the transaction we need here. Okay, so any questions regarding this particular propagation?
Sir, I have. So, sir, this not supported. So, is this for all the methods only, or any special method?
No, you can make any method. There is no restrictions here.
And what is
For
the difference
example,
between never and not supported?
see, supported will not going to throw any exception. Just it is going to hold the current transaction until the completion of the method. But never it is going to throw an exception here. For example, the same thing we are going to write on top of the get method. So get method basically, it will try to load the data from the databases or some other locations wherever we want to load here. But here we don't need any transactions here. Getting the point. So for loading purpose, if the data is available, it will load here. Otherwise, so we are not going to get any objects. Simply the empty object will return here. But in that case, now what we can do, we can make this particular method as a not supported. First we'll see the not supported. So whenever I'm making the not supported, if we are having any existing transaction, now what happens here, the existing transaction is going to suspend it until the completion of this particular get method. Okay, so once the data is loaded from the get method, again the transaction is going to be started. So as see, the transaction is going to started. But same thing, if I'm going to use never, now what happens internally? So when the get method is identified any existing transaction, so it is going to throw an exception. It is going to throw an exception here. Okay, so this is one of the differences between not supported as well as never. Here there is no the concept to call suspended concept here. So because the suspended concept it is going to use under the not supported, but the suspended concept is not going to use under the never propagation behavior. So directly it will throw an exceptions here. Okay. So any questions? Right. So now what we can identify, the remaining component here, isolation. So this is another important section we are discussing here. Propagation we completed. Now we are moving back to the isolations here. So the last one inside the propagation, if I'm going to write this, so if you see, this is support here. Now if you observe carefully, now what happening internally? Supports. So supports and not supported. So see again one more differences here. So never support and not supported. These are all the transactions. Basically, it will not use the on top of the method wherever we are using. So support basically what happens here? the current method, it does not require any transactional content here. Getting that? So the current method, wherever we are using this particular transaction annotations here, is it not required any transactions content here. But it may be run with the transaction if anyone the transaction available. Getting that? Basically, the method does not require any transaction content information. But if you are having any the existing transaction, the particular existing transaction is going to use whenever trying to execute this particular method here. But here there is no concept throwing an exception or suspending an exception, suspending this particular transaction. But simply, if you are having the transaction, it will use the same transaction to execute this particular method. If does not have any transaction, it will not throw any exception. Just we are indicating the method, it is going to support the transaction behavior also. So this is the support propagation is indicating here. Okay, so we completed this particular propagation. Now we'll move on to the isolation. So if you observe this particular isolation, so this is the another important level we need to discuss here. How this particular, like how much transaction may be impacted, so by this particular activities here. So this is important here, how the transaction is going to impact it here. This the section we are going to identify with the help of this particular isolation concept here. Okay, now we'll identify how this particular isolation concept is going to identify here. Now here, what we can identify, so we have a different types of attributes here. We'll try to discuss about the one by one, how this particular, the isolation one, it is going to work. The first one basically dirty reads here. So if I'm going to write here, the component like attribute here. So here, so it is trying to providing this. Okay, now, so isolation default we can discuss here. So what happens internally, this particular default here, it will try to use the default to isolation level. Okay, it will try to go for the default. Default, we don't have any behavior, like it will not commit the data or it will not any the rollback information. So just it will use the transaction to perform the operations here. That's it. Okay, so they say the default is not going to do much information. But now observe carefully another important information we can identify, read uncommitted. Okay, so read uncommitted. Now what we can identify this particular read uncommitted here. So always, getting the point, always we are going to read the changes data. Getting the point, always we are going to read the changes data, but the data, it is not yet committed in the database. Getting the point. So the data, it is not going to committed in the database. So this is important here. So if we want to read uncommitted information, getting the point. If you want to read uncommitted information, we can use this particular read uncommitted here. So basically, it's like a flushing data. It is not going to save permanently in the database. So as of now, the transaction, as of now, for the specific time, if the data is available, we can fetch the data. So if you are trying to work on the latest data, so you can go for this particular read uncommitted here. But this section, it is not suitable. Whatever the content we are discussing, something like bank application as well as the online ticket applications here. Okay, basically what happens internally, for example, if I'm trying to use this particular read uncommitted here, so uncommitted basically, so transaction is not going to committed in the date, the transaction not committed the data permanently. So in that case, what happens here, so if you observe carefully, so these are all the 3 seats we are having and 6 users we are having. Okay, 6 users we are having. So each user, getting this. So 2 users, they are trying to book on this particular 1 seat. Okay, so they are trying to make the payment. So whenever they are trying to make the payment up to this section, it is the uncommitted data because the seats are filled here. The seats are filled by this particular 6 users here, and each 2 user, they're trying to book on the one seat here. So once the data is committed, then only we can identify to whom we want to provide the seat here. Okay, but here what happened here? Whenever we are making this particular isolation read uncommitted here, we can give this particular seats as the 3 seats we can give to the 6 people here. So this is very important information because the data is not committed here. Because of this particular uncommitted, we are trying to use the so far whatever the information we are having in the database, we'll try to use here. Okay, so once the users are modified the data, again the same data will available in the databases. For example, this user, like one user is trying to book this particular seat. Okay, this user is trying to book this particular seat. Now he come back to the payment method. Getting the point? So payment method. So another user also can book the same seat here because this seat is not yet reserved here. Still the seat is in the open status here. The status is not yet closed. Why the status is not yet closed? Because the data, if the data is saved permanently, then only the status is going to modify here. So until the data is saved permanently, the status is not going to modify here. When the data is going to modify, whenever we are trying to click on the commit here, then only the data is going to modify here. So far, how many user can access here? Any number of users, because each and every user, they able to see still this particular seat is available. So in that case, you can, if you are interested, you can go for this particular uncommitted information here. Okay, so same opposite information, what we can use is something like read committed here. We can go for the read committed here. So when we are using this particular read committed, each and every information, once the data is committed here, those data only we are going to fetch here with help of this particular isolations here. Getting the point? So always we are going to read the current, the concurrent transaction that has been committed by the, getting the point? So the data is committed by the other transactions here. Those informations only we are going to load here. Okay. So in that case, all the the status are going to modify here. So once the status is modified here, so other user cannot identify whether we can access the particular seat or not here. Okay, so this is important. But the read uncommit basically, so whenever you're trying to work on the flushing related, like certain time I want to work on only uncommitted information, so then we can go for the read uncommitted isolation level we can use here. But most of the cases basically we'll go for the read uncommitted here. Okay, and another one is basically serializable. So this is the serializable is a very important one. It will try to work on the whatever the ACID components we discuss here. Okay, whatever this particular ACID is the components which we are having inside the transaction, it will try to follow the same information here. So this is the main information in all the applications we are going to use this particular section called serializable. Getting the point? So this is the main section we are going to use is something like serializable. So if we observe carefully, now what we will do, it will try to follow the ACID component, whatever we discuss here, the ACID. So it will group all the transaction. It will try to make the permanently like a commit or rollback here based on the state wherever it is available. It will give you the multiple users to work on the same data, and it will try to save permanently in the database based on the current status here. So these are all the 4 components we already identified here. So this particular serializable, it will try to work on this particular 4 components here. Okay, now what we can identify internally, it will making the locking system. Getting the point? Whenever we are trying to modify the data, it will make the locking. So whenever we are making the locking system, only one user can allow here. How many users we are trying to book? Getting the point? So for example, only one seat is available and 10 users are available. What happens internally? Once one user is entered into this, it will try to make the lock-in system here. So this particular lock-in system is going to release once the user is come out. It's like a synchronization. So whatever the synchronization concept we discuss here, Same way it will use here, but the synchronization is different here. It will try to make the each one thread at a time here, but here the on top of the important resource, it will make the locking functionality here. Okay, this is important here. Okay, anyway, whenever we are making this particular locking here, transaction will be slow. The transaction is going to be slow. But even though the transaction is going to slow, but the effective way of working here, the serializable queue. Getting the point? So this is important. And another component basically what we can identify here. So another important here, read only. If I want to getting the point, if I want to read the data, now what we can do, we can go for this particular read only functionality. If you're trying to modify something with help of this particular read only transaction, you will get an exception. You will get an exception here. This is important, we need to understand. So we are having read only property. Now what we can do, this particular read only property, you can make this particular section as a true here. Getting the point? So you can make this particular section as a true. So whenever we are making this particular section as a true, now what happens internally? The transaction is in the read only mode. So it will not have the permission to write the object information. It will not write the data. Like it will not going to modify the data. Only it will try to load the data. For the loading information, we are not going to modify any information, so that we can go for the this particular read only. And the another important section here, I'm making the false here. We need to identify some. We can use true only. We can make it on top of the class level. We can provide as a read only as a true. So and another one is transaction timeout here. Another one is transaction timeout. So how we can write, what is the property we are having? Timeout property. Now what we can do, this particular timeout property we can provide here. So how much time the transaction should be live here. Getting the point? So what is the duration time for this particular, the current transaction should be available, we can specify with help of this particular timeout here. Okay. Now what we can identify here, so timeout basically how it is going to take it? It is going to take as a seconds here. So if I'm going to show you the transaction, so default, now you can see it is trying to use the required here timeout here. So timeout default here. So what is the timeout default here? If I'm going to show you -1. Okay, so this is the -1 default time here. Now you can see use the default timeout for the underlying transaction system. Now what we can identify here, if we are not interested this particular default timeout here, now what we can do, we can go for the specific timeout. How it is going to take transaction attribute. Oh, so with the help of this particular transaction attribute to get a timeout, we can load here. So if we want to see the transaction attribute to get a timeout, we can easily identify how it is going to work here. So this is transaction attribute. Oh, here we don't have. Let's see anything we have. Propagation required 0, supports 1, mandatory 2, required 3. So this is also all the propagation behavior. Okay, here we are having the default timeout here. So this is only the transaction timeout we are having. Okay, so if I'm going to show you transaction definition timeout default. Now, if you are not interested in this particular default timeout, we can go for this particular timeout property. We can provide the value how we are providing. So where is this? Here we are having timeout properties. Okay, so this is important here. You can specify the seconds time here, how many seconds we want to provide. You can give you this particular time, it will available. So once the particular time is completed, now the transaction is going to roll back here. Okay, so if I want to use this particular transaction annotation here, because now we are discussing about the annotation part. If I want to use this particular annotation part, now what we can do? So we need to enable the namespace here. Like in the configuration, we need to enable some information here. So what is the information I'm going to enable here? Now if you go to see this, so spring-hibernate dot XML file here. Now here, let me copy this. I am using transaction here. So TX I'm going to use here. After using this particular TX here we need to use the same XSD, and here I'm going to modify transaction. Okay, so this is the transaction we can use it. Now you can see, okay, so here this is not working here, but anyway, now this particular section is the XSD file is loading or not. What we can do, we can copy this particular URL and paste it in the browser. If you are trying to load the XSD, so happily we can use the attribute sections here. Okay, whatever the attribute section we are having, we can use this particular attribute section. So finally, I added the transactions information. After adding this particular transaction information, now what I'm doing here I'm going to discuss about the transaction annotation. Okay, so this is the transaction annotation information we need to use here. So that whatever the transaction annotation we are using, it will try to use the transaction annotation. Is nothing but we are trying to share the information to the container. We are coming with a annotation example. Okay, we are trying to coming with this particular annotation example here. So this is the one of the important example we need to use it. So for this, now what we can do here, whatever the person service we are having, we need to comment out this. Get in the pen. We need to comment out this particular section, and these two bits we can comment out here. So the transaction related section we are trying to comment out here. Now where is the person service? This is also not required because we are not using the programmatic transaction template here. Now what we can do, I'm going to copy this, and here we can go for this particular so required I'm making, and in remaining whatever the properties we are using same. So this particular section, class level it is going to support, and the method level it is required here. And here we are making the read only, and we are not making any read only here. So if we go to this, what is the default one? Read only, false here. Okay, by default it is false. If you are not providing this section also, it will applicable. Where it is applicable? Here, because by default it is a false only. So here we need to make read only explicitly as a true, because we have a default values each and every annotations here. Okay, now this is I'm trying to use it. Now I'm going to run the same example. We'll try to, so we'll modify transactional annotation. Okay, I'm trying to providing the transaction annotation. Now you can see, so we are running this example with the help of this particular transactions here. So now you can see he's expecting a no be transaction manager. Okay, so we need to enable whatever the transaction manager. Now observe carefully. It is trying to insert the data into the person table. So whether the data is inserted or not, how we can check it? So we need to go to this particular Postgres database and identify the particular important sections here. Okay, so which one we are using? Spring JDBC only, right? Now you can see the transaction annotation is example is created. So with help of this particular 5 record, successfully we inserted the record under this particular person table. Okay, so this is the way of writing this particular transactions information here. Getting the point? This is important here. So any questions? Okay, so if we don't have anything here, now we completed the Spring Hibernate and Spring transactions here, how it is going to work internally. We come up with different ways of example. Now try to execute the multiple example with help of the transaction manager and programmatic transactions as well as the transaction annotations here. Okay, so these are all the 3 ways we can enable the transaction in our Spring based applications here. Now we are moving into the one of the important the module called Spring MVC here. Okay, so with help of this particular Spring MVC, we are going to build the web applications here. Can you see? So this is important section we need to understand here. With help of this particular MVC, we are going to build the web applications here. So how we are going to build this particular web application, we need to understand here. Because now what we will do, we are going to use the controllers using this particular MVC annotations here. So first we'll identify the stereotype annotation because we already familiar with the stereotype annotation. So if I am not using the stereotype annotations here explicitly, we need to write the lot of configurations here. We'll identify how the annotations are going to work internally. Okay, but before going to discuss about the annotation, now we need to understand one important diagram here, how the Spring MVC it is going to work internally. So internally, Spring MVC is come up with one of the important class called dispatcher servlet. One of the important class called dispatcher servlet. Let's see whether do we have the dispatcher servlet or not. I hope we will not have because we did not added any. So those are here. No. So dispatcher. So we don't have this particular dispatcher solid class because we did not added the required jar section. So but anyway, imagine here this is the dispatcher solid we are having. So how this particular dispatcher solid is going to work internally? Now we need to understand here. So as a user, as a user, this is the one application here. And this is the UI pages, like front end pages we are having here. Now you can imagine simply I provided username and password. Whenever I'm trying to click on this particular submit here, so whenever I'm trying to click on this particular submit, the request here. So whenever we are trying to click on the submit, it will try to come up with the request here. First, the request is going to received by this particular dispatcher alert here. This particular request is going to received by the dispatcher alert here. So now the dispatcher alert is going to read the information. So based on this particular information, So which controller class we want to send, it is going to decided by the dispatcher alert here. Okay, so based on this particular handler mapping, because handler mapping it is going to handle the URL. So based on the URL pattern, it will try to look up the which handler the class we want to call here. Getting but we have in the real-time application now. Imagine around 200 controller classes we are having. Okay, so 200 controller classes. The 200 controller classes having unique request information. Getting the point? Unique request information. So for example, if it is a Facebook application, so the Facebook application, how it is going to define here? For example, the first one is slash here. First one is slash. Slash is nothing but here we are going to provide something like www dot something like facebook.com. Okay, so this is a slash. After the facebook.com slash we are giving. Whenever we are trying to give this particular information, so one controller it is going to call, and the controller it will try to provide the main page related information. Whatever the required information we need for this particular main page, so those information it is going to provided by the particular main controller. Okay, so for example, this is our main controller. On top of this particular main controller, we provided something like a slasher. Okay, this is I want to use this particular slash. Now what happens here, this particular main controller, what it will do internally, this particular main controller internally, it will try to load the home page, the login information, and the create account related information, some logos. So whatever the logo we are going to show on the main page, it will load here. But how it is going to identify? The information is going to identify first dispatches alert here. So the dispatches alert, it will try to read the particular slash here. So whenever it is trying to read this particular slash, now it will try to identify the one of the handler mapping. The handler mapping, it should match with a proper controller class name. So then only the exactly the controller class it is going to match there. So we have a different types of handler mapping. We'll identify how the each and every handler mapping is going to work internally. But observe carefully. So one main controller how identified here. This main controller is identified by the one of the handler mapping. Okay, handler mapping, it is try to identify what is the request contain the information. So based on this particular request information, it will look up the classes like what are all the different classes we created and which class is suitable here. Okay, so the main controller class is suitable. It will try to call the main controller, and it will execute the whatever the code we are going to run. So this is one information. So after this, now what we will do here, if I'm going to call slash login, so facebook.com/login. Now this is the another controller. Now you can see one is a something like a login controller. Okay, login controller. So based on this particular login, now it will look up the login controller. So another one, what we can provide is something like Facebook/register. Okay, something like a register. So this is another important information we need to understand here. What it will do, this particular register, it will try to provide the another important information, something like register related controller class. So we can call, where is this? Register related controller class. Okay, we can call register. So this is the way of identifying the each and every controller. So if you are trying to updating the post, it will call with a different post. Or if you're trying to click on the any comment related section, it will call the comment controller, like controller, share controller. Get in the pen. We have a lot of here. So if you're trying to work with any Facebook pages here, so we have a different pages related controller, group related controller. Get in the pen. So how whatever the information we are having inside the Facebook, so each and every controller it is going to create it internally. Okay. So if I'm going to divide this section, now how we can identify? So we have a different types of information inside the Facebook here. First one is home here. So it's like a profile here. Okay. This section we can divide into the profile here. And this is section we can go for the groups here. And this section we can go for the pages here. Okay. And some additional information, whatever we are having. And here, whatever the post you are trying to show here, we are trying to show on the home page here. Getting the point. And the profile is a one controller, pages is a one more controller, so groups is a one more controller, some additional information whatever we are having for those. And inside the home page, so this is again different controller, like a post controller. So inside the post again we are going to have different controller, share related, comment, and different controller we are going to create, but each and everything is going to handle by the handler mapping here. So this is important here, handler mapping. The handler mapping internally, it will try to look up the one of the controller classes. Okay, so now we identify how it is going to work internally. So as I suggested, dispatches alert is our front controller. Get in the point. This is our front controller. It will stop the request which is coming from the browser. Now it will try to connect with the handler mapping. Okay, this handler mapping is going to play very important role here. So this particular handler mapping, now once it is identified, now what happens internally? It will go to the direct to controller classes here. It will try to look up the controller class. Based on this handler mapping, now dispatches alert will send the request to the controller class. So once the request is sent to this particular controller class, now controller class it will try to perform the various operations here. Getting the point. So it will go to the service class. From the service, it will go to the database for saving or loading wherever, like based on the request information, it will perform the various operations here. Okay. So now we identify from the controller to, it will go to the service. So service to DB, like a database, it is going to call here. So each and every requested, this is the main steps it is going to follow. So from the DB, again, it will come back to this service, from the service to controller, from the controller to this particular dispatches alert. So whenever it is coming back to this particular dispatches alert here, we are using one of the important concept to call model and view. Okay, so model and view. This is important. So model will contain the response data. Whatever the model we are providing, this contain the response data. So view contain the logical view name. This particular view contain the logical view name. So logical view name basically what type of the view page we are trying to return. So the name of the view page we are going to provide here. The name of the view page we are going to provide. So model, what is the response? Whatever the response we want to show on the UI pages, the response will contain under this particular model. So this is we are trying to return model and view. Okay, this is the model and view we are going to return. So once we identify this particular model and view, now what we can identify based on this particular logical view name. So whatever the logical view name we are trying to return from the controller class, now dispatches alert what it will do, it will try to connect with one of the view resolver. We have a different types of view resolver here. We'll identify how this particular view resolvers are going to work internally. Now we'll identify how this particular view resolvers we identify. So basically what it will do, this particular view resolver, based on this particular logical view name, it will give you the actual view where it is existed here. Getting the point? This is important because controller is returning logical view name. Now the dispatcher alert will handle the logical view name. The same logical view name it sent back to the views resolver. The view resolver where this particular file is located, it is going to share the information. So once the information shared to dispatcher alert, now it will try to load the original view page, original view pages here. So this is important here. The original view pages are going to loaded by the dispatch alert. So once view pages are loaded, now what happens is the response will go back to the UI page. The response is going to go back to the UI pages with the help of this particular view pages, and inside the view pages we are going to store the appropriate model data. So what is the response we want to show on the UI pages? The model will contain the response information. The response information will try to add into this particular original view file. Okay, so this is the way of the dispatches alert it is going to execute internally. So any questions on this diagram? This diagram will give you the overview of this particular dispatches alert, how it is going to work internally.
So I have one question. I'm little confused for how can we identify which one is main controller?
So far you could not understand here because if I am going to provide the different types of handler mapping, now you can easily understand here how it is going to work internally. Okay, because handler mapping we have a different types here. We need to discuss one by one how it is going to identify the appropriate controller classes. So the mainly we will try to discuss about the default annotation handler mapping class. So it will try to identify the path here. So whatever the path we are going to provide, based on the path, it will try to look up the appropriate controller class, because each and every controller class is going to come up with one specified path here. So if the path is matched, the controller class will call. Otherwise, so it will try to look up with another controller class. So this is the way right now the request mapping annotation is working here. So we'll see how the path we can create and how it is going to work internally. But now observe, this is the basic diagram we need to understand regarding this particular dispatches alert here. Now what happens internally? So once this particular dispatches alerts are completed, now what we will do? So if I want to provide this particular dispatches alerts, we need to come up with one of the web.xml file. So inside the web.xml file, we need to provide the dispatches alert information. Okay, so now what I will do, I will try to create this particular example. Can we use this? Do we have any option to convert this? We'll see. Convert facet found. Okay, so I think we don't have this. Now we need to create one more applications here. We'll see how we can create this particular another application, because this is the web-based application we need to create. For this, now what I'm doing here, I'm trying to click on this. Now we'll go to the web section. So inside this particular IDE, we have a web option here. Now you can see dynamic web project we need to use it. It is not the static web page here. So it is a dynamic web pages here. So something like a dynamic web project we need to use it. Now click on the next here. Now you can specify what is the name of your project name here. So what is the name of the project name we can provide here? Something like a Spring MVC here. So Spring -MVC I'm trying to providing here. And here, now what we can do, we can keep on this particular SRC if it is required. Otherwise, basically in the real-time scenarios, how we are going to provide here. So this is the way of providing this. SRC main Java, and another folder we are going to create here, SRC main. So resource here. Okay. So along with this, now what you can do, you can create two more folder. So src test here. Okay, src test Java. These are the test related sections here, and another one is src test resource. Okay, these are all the main source folder we are going to use here. So why we will use this particular main source? The main application will specify in the Java folder, and if you are having any property file, we'll keep inside the resource folder. And whenever you are trying to providing the market or join related sections here for each and every class, we'll keep this particular test folders here. Okay, these two are the test related folders here. Now you can see here we need to click on this particular generate web.xml. The web.xml, inside the web.xml only, we are going to specify the dispatcher alert information. Now you can see I'm trying to click on this particular finish. So whenever we are trying to click on this particular finish here, now it is trying to change the prospect here. So this is the different prospect inside this particular IDE. Okay. Now finally, now this is the our MVC applications here. Now if you see, the Java resource is containing these many. Java resource contain these many. Now if I am going to open, so this is directly src. But here, these are all the Java resource here. These many files I created. And under the web content, under this particular web content, we have a web.nf folder. So under the web.nf, we are having web.xml. So what is the information it is containing? So far empty. It is some welcome file information we are having here. So far we don't need any welcome file here. So by default, it will try to look up this particular welcome file here. Okay, this is the welcome file. Is the first file it is going to load whenever the server is going to start it. But right now, I'm not using any welcome file. I'm trying to comment out this. Okay, so here we need to use the dispatches alert section. We need to use the dispatches alert section. So if I'm trying to use this, where we can add the libraries here, because there is no the concept like adding the libraries. Now what I'm doing here, I'm trying to converting this application into the Maven application, so that we can generate the POM file and we can use the POM file to add the libraries here. Getting the point? Now you can see if I'm going to convert this, so where we are having inside the configure, convert to Maven project here. Now I'm trying to use the same version information. I'm not modifying anything here. So finally, now it is converting into the Maven application. Okay, so Spring Core also we converted into the Maven because of this particular dependency, and the same thing I'm adding inside the like MVC also. Okay, so this is we are going to use. And finally, now what we will do, we'll try to add the dependency sections here. So to add this, now what we can do, Maven repository. So we need to go to this website here, and so Web MVC. This is the Web MVC we are going to use here, and which one we can discuss here, something like I'm trying to use a 4 version. Okay, so now you can see I'm trying to use all the 4 versions here, dependencies, and here I'm trying to providing this, and save here. Whenever I'm trying to save, first we need to identify whether the particular dispatcher alert class is loading or not. So here you can see we have a dispatcher alert class. Okay, which is coming from the where org Spring Framework web.servlet. Getting the point? This is important. Now this particular class we created. Now this section where we are going to write under this particular web.xml. So what are the tags we are going to use here? The tags we are going to use here, servlet here. So inside this particular servlet, now we are going to come up with a servlet name here. Okay, whatever the name we are going to provide here, the name of the configuration file we need to provide, because this is the mapping conversion here. Like this is the format we need to use. Whatever the server like servlet name we are going to use it, name of this particular servlet name only we need to provide the configuration file here. So something like what I'm doing here. What is an application? So simply I'm trying to providing Spring here. Okay, Spring I'm trying to providing. So after this, so we need to go for the servlet class here. What is the servlet class we need to provide? Whatever we discussed just now. org Spring Framework, org Spring Framework dot web dot servlet dot dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet. Okay, so this is important here. This is the main class we need to add. So org, with help of this particular fully qualified name we need to add here. So org Spring Framework web.servlet.dispatcher servlet here. And another one is mapping section we need to provide. So what is the mapping section we can provide here? Something like how we want to provide the servlet mapping here. Name of the file name is same, and here URL pattern. So URL pattern I'm giving slash any request. Okay, slash is basically any request we can forward it into the dispatcher servlet. Whatever the request we are going to hit from this application, it should handle by the dispatcher servlet. So this is I'm sharing the information. Because of that I'm giving the slash here. Only slash. This is important. Okay. Now once we provided this, the dispatcher servlet is ready to handle the request which is coming from the browser. Okay. So now we understand this. But now we need to discuss about the another important sections called handler mapping. So before going to discuss about the handler mapping, now what we can do, we need to create the configuration file. So how we can create the configuration file? With help of this particular servlet name here. Okay, with help of this particular servlet name here. Now, so file I'm trying to create here, spring hyphen servlet.xml. Okay, spring hyphen servlet.xml. This is the pattern we need to follow whenever we are trying to create the web application configuration files. Okay, then only the dispatcher servlet will understand here where this particular file is available, what is the name of this particular file. Now what we can do, we'll copy whatever we used here. So far whatever we used here, I'm trying to copy same information inside this particular file. But only now what is the changes we can use here? What are the changes we can use? We'll go for the 4 version. Okay, so we can go for this particular 4 versions here. This is important here. Now the context we are going to use same as it is, and transaction will use we'll try to use the same, and another one MVC related we need to use here. So to use this particular MVC related here, now I'm trying to copy this. Here I'm trying to paste here something like MVC. So here I need to write MVC and MVC. Okay, so these are all the XSD conversion here. Now you can see successfully the files are loading with help of this particular 4.1. Okay, so this is the configuration file we provided. Now we need to discuss about the writing the controller classes. So how we can write this particular controller classes. Now what I will do, first I'm going to write the one of the important class called home controller. Home controller. So where I'm going to write this particular home controller inside the Java section class I'm trying to write home controller and package here com dot string dot MVC. Okay, so this is the home controller. Now once we write this particular home controller, as we discussed here, we are going to come up with a controller annotation. Okay, controller annotation. Now once we provided this particular controller annotations here, it will try to handle the request related section. It will handle the request related sections here. So finally, now what I'm doing is here public string and simply we can write a home page. Simply we are going to write the home page and simply we'll try to return the home here. Okay, simply we'll return this particular home page and what we can identify this request mapping. So request mapping, now what I'm doing is simply slash I'm giving. Okay, whenever we are trying to give this particular slash, we are trying to return the home page. Okay, this is important here. So this is the request mapping is important here. This particular request mapping only, it will identify the which handler mapping we need to call here. Which handler mapping we need to call, it is identified by this. Okay, so anyway, now we created this particular request mapping. Now what we can identify, so what are all the handler mapping we are having? So what are all the handler mapping we are having? First one, now I'm trying to write bean name handler mapping. So getting the so bean name URL handler mapping. So I'm trying to write with the shortcuts here. So bean name URL handler mapping. So what exactly it will do this particular bean name? So it is going to map the controllers. Getting this? It is going to map the controller to this particular URL. So based on this particular name of the beans here, the controller class bean name. So here the URL pattern, it should match with the controller class bean names. For example, what is the controller class we are having? Home controller. Whenever we are having this particular home controller, now what we will do, we'll try to specify the URL pattern something like slash home. Whenever we are trying to providing this particular slash home, directly it will try to look up this particular home controller. Okay, so this is the bean name URL handler mapping. It is going to play important role. If I want to convert the URL pattern based on this particular controller name, we can make this particular handler mapping. Okay, so another one, what we can identify here, another one basically controller bean name URL mapping. So I'm trying to write controller, the controller class name handler mapping. This is important. So bean name URL handler mapping and controller, the controller class name handler mapping. So whenever we are writing this particular controller class name handler mapping, now it is similar to this particular bean name URL mapping here, but what we can identify here, so in this case, the bean names are not required to follow URL conversion. Getting the point? So whatever the name of the bean we are going to create in our configuration file to create the object here. So we are not going to follow the same pattern. Simply we'll try to follow the name of the controller class. Okay, the name of the whatever the controller class we are having, we are going to follow this particular class names here. Getting the point? So this is another important here. And the another one is this section here, default annotation handler mapping. Default to annotation handler mapping. The default to annotation handler mapping, it is going to map the request to this particular controller, and controller methods are annotated with request mapping. So this is the default annotation handler mapping, we are going to use most of the cases here. Most of the cases we are going to use this particular default annotation handler mapping. So why we are going to use this? Because internally it is going to map the whatever the request we are getting to this particular controller classes and the controller method that are annotated with request mapping. So inside the controller classes, whatever the method is annotated with request mapping, so internally it will try to look up the path here. So the path and the request is going to match here. So directly it will try to convert the path in the particular handler mapping into the specified the controller class. So in our controller, so this is the simple one. Now we are providing the request mapping. So simply we are providing the slash. If any request will come with a slash, so it will try to convert it into this particular home controller class. Okay, same way, how many request mapping you are going to write with a different URL pattern, because so URL pattern is a unique pattern. So we cannot provide the same pattern for the multiple classes. Okay, so whatever the URL we are going to create, it should be the unique. So each and every classes are going to have the unique information, so that the dispatches are late based on this particular handler mapping. Internally, it is trying to identify the request mapping based on the request mapping URL pattern. It will call the appropriate controller class. Okay, so this is important. And now we have another one also, like a simple URL handler mapping. So basically based on the property collection. So basically if I want to handle this particular simple URL handler mapping, we need to write the URL patterns like this. Like the URL pattern, we can create the props here, and we can go for the prop key, something like a URL pattern. So what is the URL pattern? Slash, okay, slash home. If it is a slash home, we need to go to the home controller. Okay, and one more prop key. So one more prop key. If it is a something like a slash login. Okay, if it is a slash login. Now what we can do? We need to write the login controller. So explicitly, get in the pen. Explicitly, we need to define the how many controller classes we are having, and each and every controller classes, what is the URL pattern we are having. So now imagine here, if we are having 200 classes, if we are having 200 the controller classes, we need to write this particular property around 200. Okay, so now imagine, so how much it is a lengthy process. If you want to modify again, you need to come back to the configuration file. You need to modify this. Okay, so this is not the suitable one. So the simple URL mapping here, get in the pen, because we are going to provide with a key value pair. If the key is matched, it will try to look up the value class. So it will try to go to the appropriate controller class here. Okay, so this is the simple URL we can write here, but it is not sufficient here. So either we can go for this particular bean name URL handler mapping, or we can go for the default annotation handler mapping. Okay, so most of the cases, like we'll try to go for the default annotation, but some cases, if it's right, if we want to write the handler mapping for this particular bean name URL handler mapping, we need to write explicitly. Get in pen. We need to write this particular bean name URL handler mapping explicitly configuration, so that we can identify this. So let me provide the classes section first. So bean name URL, so bean name URL handler mapping. So this is the particular class. Now you can see it is trying to checking the slash like start with or you can see anything here. So what happened internally? It is trying to load the get application context dot alias names. Now what you understand this, the bean name URL handler mapping, basically it is trying to load the name of the bean, whatever the name of the bean we are going to create in the configuration file. So it is going to start with this particular start. It is going to add into the URLs. So this is the URLs we are having. Okay, so otherwise now it is trying to load the alias name of the bean, and again it is trying to check with start with, and if it is start with this, Now it is adding into this particular alias name, and finally it is returning the URLs here. Now what you understand here? So we need to understand simply, if I'm going to create the home controller, what is the name of the home controller being? So simply we are going to create something like a home controller. Okay, this is the home controller we are going to create. But when we are using this particular bname URL handler mapping, now what we need to understand here? So it should start with a slash home controller. It should start with a slash home controller, or you can go for the slash home also. Anything, if I'm trying to providing this, it should match it. But if I'm trying to providing this information, now what happens here? Whenever we are sending the request also having the same URL pattern. Either you should add the home controller, or you need to add the slash home. Then only the home controller it is going to execute here. Then only the home controller is going to execute here. So same way, now imagine how many controller classes we are going to have. So each and every controller class, you should write your own the URL pattern. So then only the bname URL handler mapping, it will try to construct all the URLs, and finally it will return the list of URLs here. It will try to return this particular list of URLs. So this is the one example we are able to see how the bname URL handler mapping it is going to work. Okay, and another one. So as I suggested, so directly we will go for this default annotation handler mapping. Okay, this is the default annotation handler mapping is extending from the one class here. So what is using? It is trying to use use default suffix pattern, and now you can see it is using the users dot star and users. So something slash. It is trying to use the different patterns here. What we can identify here? So now you can set this particular default suffix pattern, or finally this method is going to call. So determine URLs for handler. Getting the point? So this method is going to call internally. It will determine the which pattern we are using. So it will return all the patterns here. Okay. So if we want to understand more about this particular the mapping classes, put a breakpoint on top of the method here and execute our application. You can easily understand how it is going to work internally. Getting the point? The default annotation handler mapping and the bname URL handler mapping. So you can put a breakpoint and you can run this example. You will understand how it is executing this. But what are the handler mapping we are using? The handler mapping we are going to use default annotation handler mapping here. Okay. So this is one of the important example we need to understand here. Right now, directly we can create the one of the controller classes. Now, so far what we discuss here. So we discuss about the dispatches are late here. We discuss about the dispatches are late. Now we are trying to discuss about the handler mapping, and now we created the one of the controller class here. So what we need to understand the remaining section, view resolver. Getting the point. So this is the another important section we need to understand here, view resolver. So how this particular view resolver it is going to work. So to understand this particular view resolver, now what we need to understand here, what are the different types of view resolvers we are having, and which one is the best one we can use, and we'll try to identify those view resolvers here. Okay, so I'm stopping this session up to here. So tomorrow we'll continue this particular view resolver. So once we complete this particular view resolver, we are going to run the simple example here. With help of this particular Spring MVC, we'll start the web-based application here. The first application we are going to define here. So we'll try to cover up with login and registrations information here, and with help of the Hibernate. Getting the point. With help of this particular Hibernate, we are going to write the Spring MVC application, and the same thing we are going to use the transaction we are going to apply. Okay, whatever the transaction we discuss, we are going to apply the same transaction, and whatever we discuss about the Hibernate, we are going to apply the same Hibernate functionality into the MVC. Okay, so just I'm going to copy the configurations information, and I will paste it inside the MVC, the application file, like configuration file. Okay, so we'll see in the tomorrow session the first example how it is going to work. So Spring MVC related sections here. Any questions so far? Okay. So if we don't have anything, so we'll continue tomorrow.